Hello, and welcome to an EntheoRadio edition. This is Trevar Hughes, also known as Captain Hugh T. Alchemy. I'm here with a very special guest today, Stephen Gray, and we're going to be talking about cannabis, shamanism, and a whole lot more. You may have noticed that we're on Facebook Live doing events now, so please jump in and join us in the future through that method. And hopefully we'll be able to take live callers, possibly live questions and comments. But for now, we're recording this, and it'll be up on our social media by the end of the day. Happy summer solstice. Is it summer solstice, Stephen?
It is 8:45 a.m. this morning.
How wonderful. Yes, a good day to restart, right?
Mm-hmm. Every day is a good day to restart, actually.
Absolutely, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So Stephen Gray is a speaker, he's an author, he's a ceremonial leader, and he's a conference organizer on spiritual subjects, including entheogenic medicines. He's worked extensively with Tibetan Buddhism and the Native American Church and other sacramental medicine traditions. He's also been a wonderful guest sharing with us some medicine songs on EntheoRadio several years ago. He's authored a couple of books, Returning to the Sacred World, a spiritual toolkit for emerging reality, for the emerging reality. And he's a contributor to Cannabis and Spirituality, an explorer's guide to an ancient plant spirit ally. I think that's what we're going to talk a lot about today, right, Stephen?
Mm-hmm. And by the way, I'm the editor and one of 18 contributors to the Cannabis and Spirituality book. It's my project, basically.
Cool. Yeah. Very cool. And so tell us a little bit about that project to start. Let's have the book with you, by the way.
Say that again?
Is the book with you? Do you have it there as a visual aid?
Hang on a sec. I've got a sort of a somewhat beat up copy of it over here. Yeah, this is a little rugged looking, but it'll do. That's the book.
Very cool.
Yeah. And it's available everywhere, basically. Published by Inner Traditions, Park Street Press. But it's on, all the usual online sites like Amazon, and bookstores generally have it or will get it quickly. So anyway, enough of the plugging. Now it depends on how much you want to know about what led to this, because there's no beginning, right? Just like there's no beginning to the universe or whatever. But the beginning was the first time I smoked pot, I guess you could say, way back, 50 years ago or so. But I won't go into all that detail. But I will say that that I came of age in a time when there was an explosion of interest in the psychedelics, or entheogens, which, by the way, thank you for getting correct, because a lot of people don't get that word pronounced correctly. Mm-hmm. They sort of struggle through it and end up with something like ethneogenic or whatever, but
right.
Entheogens. And for anyone watching or listening who's not familiar with the word, it's a synonym for psychedelics, and it came into play because at the time, this was I think 1979 when it was coined, the word psychedelics had a lot of inappropriate baggage associated with it, like advertising nonsense and different things like that. So it basically means, it does mean, it comes from the Greek, and it means generating the spirit or divine within. And it's now you sort of traded off between psychedelic and entheogen, because it's come so far in time since then that psychedelic doesn't really have that baggage anymore for people that are younger, especially. Anyway, I was interested in all that stuff and the spiritual side of things, which exploded in my youth as well, particularly Asian spirituality like Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism, that sort of thing. So those two streams, psychedelics and spiritual work, if you will, dovetailed for a lot of people, including myself. And cannabis kind of slipped in there as a little brother, so to speak,
Right.
But it wasn't until I kind of moved away from that world for a while. Not the spiritual side of it, but one of the memes at the time was, okay, so you've had some maybe door-opening experience with acid, LSD, or whatever, and now what are you going to do? You're going to take acid every day for the rest of your life to try to keep the channel open. So the idea that a lot of people picked up on was having some sort of daily spiritual practice, or ongoing connection. And for me, that became Tibetan Buddhism, and that community wasn't really interested in the psychedelics or cannabis particularly. So I left them aside for 10 or 15 years. And then in the late 80s, Terence McKenna kind of reopened those doors for me by pointing out that there were thousands of years of history of shamanic healing use of these psychedelic medicines. And so that got me back into it, and, and then it's a long story from them. That was about 1990. The long and the short of it is I got involved in several entheogenic or psychedelic or sacramental medicine traditions, and then got involved in organizing a conference up here called the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference here in Vancouver, which, by the way, is an amazing conference. We get some of the best people in the world to come in to talk about these, and we're in our 9th year now.
Wow.
It's in November 1st to 3rd, and for a little plug for that, it's spiritplantmedicine.com.
Okay.
Spiritplantmedicine.com, if anyone wants to look it up. Anyway, so I got involved in organizing that, and through that I met Kathleen Harrison, who's the ex-wife of Terence McKenna,
Right.
and we got talking together about how, well, I told her that I thought cannabis wasn't getting the respect it deserves as a spiritual ally, which it has had in many places, over a very long time, perhaps going back 10,000 years or so. But currently, as most people would acknowledge, well, it's changing fast now, but it's used recreationally, obviously, and increasing number of medicinal uses. But very few people understand, because they just haven't used it that way, or they haven't heard about it being used that way, that when you channel it skillfully in the right kind of environment or context or container, that it has a power that's really surprising to a lot of people. So I was having this conversation with Kathleen Harrison, saying that I thought this needed redressing, I guess you could say. And
Yes.
I said, but I'm not enough of an expert on it, or a scholar for that matter, to write a whole book about it, I don't think. She said, well, if you organized it as a project, I'd contribute a chapter to it. And that was the trigger for me, because she's a wonderful writer and a very wise soul too, actually. And she's, I would say, a world-class ethnobotanist as well.
Yes.
So that led to the book, essentially, too.
What year was that?
That was a conversation right after our conference. She had come up here to speak in 2012, and we were sitting in my car in the rain in front of my favorite spiritual bookstore having that conversation. I had taken her around. She's a mushroom expert, and she wanted to see what mushrooms were growing in the fall in Vancouver, and so I took her around to a few spots. We were looking for the local psilocybe cyanescens, which
yes.
grow around Vancouver, but we didn't find any that day.
That's nice. Very nice.
Anyway, yeah, so that was 7 years ago, and so the book, kind of unfolded over that, and it, quite honestly, not to boast, but it really did feel like it was supported all along, like by, I don't know, the spirit of the plant, maybe, if I want to get woo-woo about it, but something, it's like it needed to come in, because everything fell in place easily. Everybody I asked to contribute to it just said yes automatically. The publisher picked it up. I sent them an electronic book proposal on a Sunday evening, and the guy wrote me back on a Monday morning and said, looks just right for us. So
yes, yeah.
And it's selling really well too. It's just so, it's a message whose time has come, really, that because it's not just about cannabis. We can get into that if you're curious about it, but it's not just about cannabis. It's about the fact that, and in fact, this is really the ultimate of all of this, and all the psychedelics work all together, is that what we need is a really deep and widespread consciousness transformation on this planet if we're going to get through the next couple of 100 years or whatever. And the thing is that the psychedelics, including cannabis, can play a big role in that if they're understood properly. So that's what it's really about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that historical share there. It seems like it's been so when was the book published? 2000 and
December 2016, so it's
2016.
a little over 2 years old now.
Excellent.
Yeah, sold about 12,000 copies so far, so that's encouraging.
And that was Inner Traditions Bear & Co.?
Yeah. The imprint that does the psychedelics and related work is called Park Street Press. It's all under the Inner Traditions umbrella.
Right. Yeah. And they've really been supportive of our show in the past, hooking us
really?
great
Nice.
reviews and review copies. I'm surprised
Excellent.
I don't have a copy of that book yet, but I'm sure that's in the works.
They would if you ask. Manzanita Carpenter would be the one to contact there.
Right.
She's the publicity director, and she is very good. Yeah, yeah, they're good. I'm happy with them. They show up at conferences with a table and all that kind of thing. And if I ever ask for a copy for somebody, they just send it. Or if I'm going to be giving a talk somewhere, they'll send copies, that sort of thing. Yeah, and they connect me to people that do interviews too. Not this one, but I can't remember how we found each other, but that's all in the past now. So we just keep going here. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you had really high regard in the last interview we did. I remember vaguely the content had something to do with you singing a wonderful medicine song at the end of the show. And I believe it had something to do with some tribal elders that maybe practice a peyote ceremony or something like that.
That was it. Yeah, it's actually the Native American church.
Right.
And yeah, and their sacrament is peyote, and they have these prayer songs, they're called, which go back, at least 150 years or more. Who knows how long they go back? The church itself, in fact, it's only a church because they figured that was the way to get the Americans to give them a bit of a break, because the Americans didn't have any respect for their traditions or their religious practices. And so they kind of sat down and said, well, let's see, maybe if we incorporate as a church, they'll give us a little more respect. And indeed, that's what happened. Although they've had that was in like the 1880s. So, we're talking 150 years ago. And for a long time, they did get still a hard time, but the church grew like crazy. And now they're probably close to 400,000 members, although they don't have like official membership in that sense. It's more like a spiritual connection, but they probably do have 400,000 members, mostly in the western half of the United States, but some in Canada and some in other parts of the U.S. as well. But yeah, and they have these songs. And for about 12 years, I was going fairly frequently down to Washington State to participate in them. And then a couple of the elders that were running meetings passed away, and one thing led to another, and I just stopped going at some point, 3 or 4 years ago. So haven't been there lately, but I did know 30 or 40 of their prayer songs at one point.
Beautiful. I mean, and that was such a blessing. One of my favorite EntheoRadio moments was when you were sharing that.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah.
And you've moved forward into more work with cannabis as a spiritual ally and leading ceremonies like with the cannabis spirit. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's been really interesting. It's another one of these things that just kind of, as I was saying earlier about the book project, just kind of fell into place. I didn't set out to market myself particularly as a cannabis ceremony leader, but what happened was, for the book, I wanted to put a chapter in there with some suggestions that people could use if they wanted to do cannabis ceremonies. And so I concocted this chapter that I think I called, Cannabis Ceremonies, a Flexible Template or something like that. And as I thought of it, I realized I didn't have enough experience actually doing it to really, say what I wanted to say and give people enough guidance. So I gathered together about 10 friends, very experienced with both meditation and sacramental medicines, including cannabis, but psychedelics, etc. And we had an all-day ceremony, used an edible in the morning to keep us going, give us that duration factor, and then topped it up with tokes here and there, a couple times during the day. Ended up with a little feast. And I just I've been around a lot of ceremonial environments of one kind or another. I grew up in the Christian church, didn't bring too much from that. Mostly it was boring, but the Tibetan Buddhism rituals and, other kind of group things I've been involved in, and ayahuasca and anything that anything, I just kind of brought it all in and used what I felt was appropriate, just created my own sort of hybrid ceremonies out of it. And people were, that went extremely well, that very first one. It really opened my eyes too, because several of the people there did not have a positive relationship with cannabis, or historically hadn't in their lives. They either didn't like it because they didn't like where it took their thinking, or they maybe liked it for 2, 3, 4 years when they were 18, 19, 20, and then at a certain point it turned sort of sour on them, and I think that happens a lot to people as well. But what they discovered, and what I've continued to discover since then, that was probably 4 or 5 years ago when I had that one, is that when you do this, when you meet this medicine with the right intention, like the intention to be present and to open up, and to calm down and to really give it your full attention, whether you're doing that alone, which that's one of the wonderful things about cannabis, by the way, is that I would not say that for ayahuasca, for example, and for the most part, most people would be much better off doing psilocybin even, and LSD and others in either a therapeutically guided environment or a ceremonial environment for some reasons that I could tell you. I won't now because it's a bit of a tangent, but if you're interested as we go along, I could tell you a little bit more about why I think that's so important, and that actually has a lot to do with our conference, what we're trying to do to promote the skillful use of these plants substances. Anyway, people were saying that at this first one that they had experiences that they'd never had before with cannabis, and some of them were really surprised. Like, it just totally changed their relationship to cannabis altogether. Now starting to see it as a sacred plant worthy of respect, worthy of being treated like that. Yeah, I mean, again, the lovely thing about cannabis is it's very gracious that way. I was going to say a moment ago, I kind of lost my thread there for a sec. I would not suggest to people that they do ayahuasca alone, as I said, or some of these others, but cannabis is forgiving enough and potentially gentle enough if you know the material you're working with and you're aware of the dosage and so on, that you can do a solo ceremony with it. Yeah, or you can do it in with somebody else who's kind of guiding things, or in a group or whatever. But so out of that first one, people started requesting, let's do another one, and kind of went from there. And then people started to hear about this work a little bit more through the Cannabis and Spirituality Facebook group and through the conference that I'm involved in. And then I started getting requests from places outside of Vancouver saying, could you come up to, our town and do one? So I've probably done about 20 or 30 of them now. Like I said, I'm not like trying to make a business out of it or anything like that. So it's just pretty much whenever somebody wants one, I usually say yes, But again, the real point of all that is that, in terms of sharing with your audience, is that, I just did one last weekend, and it was really interesting because the people who came, they had, 4 of them had read it, heard about it on an online reservation booking service called Retreat Guru, and the description that was in there, I looked at it. It made it pretty clear, that we had the potential of doing some pretty deep work, but they didn't quite read it that way. They thought they were coming for sort of this light, sort of Sunday walk in the park, smoke a little weed, do a little yoga, maybe listen to a little music, that sort of thing. And what they found out was you can go really deep with this plant, and quite honestly, to be sort of rigorously honest about it, I guess you could say, we did include a very small amount of mushroom, psilocybin mushroom, in a chocolate for those who wanted to. Not everyone did at that one. Most people did. And what that does, when it's a small enough dosage, is that it doesn't take over. It doesn't become a mushroom experience. It just adds to the cannabis work. It just deepens it a little, intensifies it a little. We're talking just above microdose level, basically, or around there, sort of like a quarter of 1 dried gram in a chocolate kind of, yeah, just down around there. And if you just took one of those by itself, you'd really notice it. It's not visual, but I can really notice this. But when it comes in, so basically the trajectory of these, when I do the day-long ones, sometimes do evening ones where we just do an inhalable, but for the day-long ones, we'll start, say, 10 in the morning, and have an edible. And I've got little chocolates that I get from the same person every time. I know they're carefully titrated, carefully measured out. They're 10 milligram chocolates, and they're relatively mild, but noticeable again, definitely noticeable. give people about an hour and a half to let that fully reach peak. It's not going to go any further after an hour and a half, especially if you haven't eaten right before. And I always make sure people don't eat for a couple of hours before they do this. And then when it's reached that peak, I stop them or I get their attention. And so in that hour and a half, they're doing silent meditation, little bits of it, 5, 10, 15-minute chunks, just follow the breath kind of meditation to be really present for her, as I like to say, and mix that up with some guided meditations, body scans, breath work, visualization, like white light visualization kind of thing, a little bit of stretching and movement, a little bit of walking meditation, and just kind of go like that for about an hour and a half. And then at that point, I'll hit a little ding, and I'll say, okay, so you're not going to go any higher with the edible now. If you want to go deeper, or I actually almost prefer the word deep to high, because high kind of implies you lifting up out of your body almost. But cannabis is also a lot about becoming more embodied. Like, the body that we have is our vehicle for this particular incarnation that we're in, right? Yeah. So as the great mystic Teilhard de Chardin once put it, physical energy must be mastered for spiritual energy to manifest, right? So, we have to know how to open this channel physically, and cannabis is really good for that. If you use it in that way. So at that point I say, well, okay, so you're ready to go a little deeper. Now we're going to have some joints. We're going to smoke some joints. And so I give them another 10 minutes or so to see how that feels if they have a couple of puffs. And then I say, okay, now you've reached the peak of those two combined. And if you want to go a little deeper, here's the mushrooms. And I've already introduced them earlier. And then we just go through the whole rest of the day like that. Every hour or two, I ask anyone if they want a little top up on the smoke. Or I have vaporizers too for people who don't like smoke. And then we just do that all day till about 4:30 or 5. And then one of those borrowed practices that I mentioned is I used to do a Buddhist practice that ended with a feast, like a potluck feast kind of idea. And it was called Vajrayogini feast practice. And but at these retreats, there's a host who prepares the food. And so we eat at the end of the ceremony, oftentimes right in the circle. And even if we go elsewhere to eat, like over to a dining room, it's really interesting. People don't really want to talk yet, and so they end up making a practice out of eating, like real mindful eating, like just relating to that, chickpea curry or whatever it is, right? And that's pretty cool too. And then if we've eaten in the ceremonial circle, we'll then do a sharing, or we'll do the sharing and then go eat. But that's the whole thing. And people, like I said, these ones that came through Retreat Guru, they, in the sharing sessions that we did, they were saying things like, I had no idea that it would be this powerful, that it would be this deep. It was transformative for a number of these people, So that's been very exciting to see what potential this plant has, as I say, with the little assistance from the mushroom. But even without it, if you can handle a stronger dosage of the cannabis, and again, that's a key point too. My favorite phrase about that is the optimal dosage of cannabis is the dosage that you both want to and can handle. And so what can handle means is that you can open up to it, you can relax with it, you can more or less get out of your head and not be dizzy and nauseous and freaked out and all that sort of stuff. If you can stay present and dignified with it, go for it, because it's a psychedelic in that sense. Yeah.
So I just came from Las Vegas, and out of personal experience, I'm noticing, and obviously this isn't a ceremonial use case, but people are generally taking edibles in the larger quantities than you were suggesting for your ceremonial use, sometimes upwards of 100 milligrams of THC oil in these like little edible chocolates describing. Have you experimented with that dose? What's your experience with people taking 100 milligrams or more? Any comments
No.
there?
Well, not experienced with that actually, because, back in the days, which aren't that far back, when nobody was measuring any of this stuff. You know, they were
Right.
just making up a batch of brownies, and no one had any idea. You know, and there are many stories in the culture, as I'm sure you know, Trevar, of people overdoing it with edibles. And so I'm really careful with that. I'm not going to send somebody at one of my ceremonies into the deep end, you know, without being really careful about that. The thing is, you know, the way that I described, we can build it up as we go. You know, you can add more. You can have another chocolate. You can have a little mushroom chocolate. You know, and people are finding, you know, the thing is, you know, without taking 100 milligrams of an edible, you can have like a full opening experience. You know, you can land on, you know, ultimate peace in a sense. You know, the heart can open. You can be flooded with love coming through. You know, in the same way that can happen with psychedelics or you know, the so-called major psychedelics. I'd like to put cannabis in that camp as well, and a lot of other people agree with me actually. No, I haven't, you know, done that kind of dosage. So the thing too is that depends on how often you're doing it, because there's a distinct tolerance effect. If you're doing that, you know, more or less daily, 100 milligrams is going to be, you know, roughly equivalent to 10 or 20 milligrams for somebody that only does it once a week or once every 2 weeks. You know
Right.
what I mean? Yeah. I mean, I know people that smoke or vaporize cannabis daily. And I know one guy in particular, and you know, he's no slouch. He's, you know, 50 years old. He's one of the more active people I know. He's accomplished a lot, and he's very engaged in life. He likes to get high starting in the morning because it just puts him into a more calm zone. He's a bit edgy as a person, right? So it just kind of settles him down a little, and he can focus. That's great. But what he told me is that he can't smoke the sativa strains at all. They don't do anything for him at all. And
Hmm.
I actually use the sativa leaning strains in the ceremonies because those are the ones that are more sort of expansive, you know. They're, you know, they tend to be, you know, it's much more complex than that, obviously, and there's all the terpenes that have their own influence and so on and so on. But as a sort of an overly generalized rule of thumb, sativa leaning strains tend to be more airy in a sense, more, excuse me, I did turn my sound off. Good, yeah. I just got a little buzz on the phone. More, you know, airy, more open, more spacious, more sort of, I don't know, I say more spiritual in that sense, you know. Um, so that's the more mind quality in a sense. And this guy doesn't have any effect from sativas. He says he has to vaporize an indica because it has that body energy, and so it gives him that relaxation, that calming that he has. But I wouldn't call that a high. So if you want to, you know, so if he was to take a large, you know, edible, same thing, he probably wouldn't have that much of an effect from it. I don't know, these people you're talking about, I wonder how often they're using the plant.
Well, Las Vegas and certain states within the U.S., because they've recently recreationalized cannabis and
Right.
thereof, have found tourism coming, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
wanting to get really just baked, if
yeah, yeah,
for literal,
yeah. So
literal ways.
right. So my question to those people would be, or about those people would be, what happens when you do that? Like, how present are you? You know, like, is it just an escapist thing at that point? I mean, you can get really baked on alcohol too, right?
Right.
And then it's just you're just kind of like you know, there's a there's an old term, I don't know if people still use it with alcohols. When you get pretty drunk, you say, "I'm feeling no pain," or "I was feeling no pain," right? But
Hmm.
that's what alcohol does. It's a tranquilizer. You know, they used to use it for operations, right?
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, they did before they came up with all these modern things. It was one of the ways, you know, like you ever watch like an old cowboy movie, and before they cut
Yes.
the guy's foot off, they force some Irish whiskey down his throat, right? Yeah. so so it's an escapism that way. You know, that's why people become alcoholics essentially, mostly is because they're drinking to numb the edgy stuff. And yeah, and cannabis can do that too in its own way. You know, just puts you into this sort of more, you know, like chilled out zone or whatever the heck that is. You know, but um, that to me is almost the opposite of sacramental use or awakening use. So I don't know what these people experience when they have that. Maybe they have psychedelic kind of experiences, or they see gargoyles coming out of the fireplace. I don't know. But I mean, because that kind of stuff does happen sometimes when you take huge edible doses,
I have had those personal experiences myself.
Yeah.
I don't know what dosage I took. I just remember a long time ago, I was very pro all of the psychedelics, and I was given I think it was a space cake, which is kind of like a brownie. And they couldn't tell me how strong they were. It was a delicious little confectionery thing, like a cake, and didn't have an effect immediately, right? Because it's a cannabis edible. And then like a couple hours later, I was in it, and I was like in this altered experience, seeing my thoughts, having gaps of memory, like not knowing if my words were inside or outside my head, if I were speaking my words. And I almost had that level of experience for a whole 24 hours.
Yeah, that's obviously a really strong dose. Yeah. So, for anyone who wants to explore cannabis for its spiritual potential, dosage really is important, and especially with edibles. I mean, if you're a sensitive person, and especially with the high THC content in a lot of the bud these days, you can have a full-on psychedelic experience without eating it or taking it orally too. But the ceiling of experience is generally higher with edibles, and almost limitless. I mean, I've read lots of reports, trip reports and things like this, and historically too. I have a book over on my shelf behind me here called Orgies of the Hemp Eaters, and it's a tongue-in-cheek title, but it's actually a well-done compendium of essays, articles, anecdotes, stories, and stuff from the history of cannabis. A lot of it from India, because the British went there and took over their country for a couple of hundred years there, and there was a lot of cannabis over there, a lot of hashish drinks, bong lassis and things like this, and so a lot of these Brits tried that, and quite a number of them wrote about it actually, and so you have people like, I remember this one guy talking about how he took some edible or whatever with his doctor and his couple of friends or family around, I guess he was at least that cautious, but and then he lay down on the bed or whatever, and he had perceptual distortions that are almost incomprehensible, kind of like what you were talking about yourself a moment ago. He said like something like a pin dropped on the floor, and he thought it was a huge explosion, and he jumped up and freaked out, that kind of thing. You ever heard of the Hashish Club of France?
Was that like the Poets Society thing, maybe?
Sort of like that. Yeah, it was. They weren't just poets. There were about a half a dozen well-known figures in the world of writing and so on, like Émile Zola, I think the novelist, Charles Baudelaire, a couple of these people were involved in it. It was really interesting. They had I'll try to keep this short. We're getting a little long in the tooth here, but they had a rich friend with a big mansion. This was in the 1850s, I think, in Paris. And they had access to hashish balls that they'd gotten from Turkey or somewhere in the Middle East. And this guy, once a month or something like this, they would go over to this guy's house. They'd have a big feast. They probably had servants and everything, a big dinner. And then they'd plunk one of these hash balls into their coffee. And then they'd kind of separate and go their own way around the house, and then in this book on the Hashish Club, or Le Club de Hashishin, or I think in French, they would describe things like the two I remember. That's where the gargoyle metaphor came from. Not metaphor, because one guy was sitting alone in the living room looking at the fireplace, and he said there were gargoyles coming out of it. Wow. Another guy wanted to go up the central spiral staircase, that was in the big mansion, and he said he was absolutely convinced that it took him 1,000 years to get up the staircase. I mean, you've experienced time distortion on cannabis, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, in a high dose, it can be ridiculously distorted. And one more thing that I think is actually really interesting about these high dose experiences is that, and this is why I like to call cannabis an advanced spiritual medicine, because to really have it open you up and be fully present for it, not swamped by these energies and having perceptual experiences that you can't make sense of head nor tail, right? But actually to be present and awake. And, you know, a spiritual awakening involves being calm, at peace, with your heart open, right?
Yes.
And so to be able to do that is a challenge, because cannabis can be an ego dissolver just the way the so-called major psychedelics are. And one of my favorite little anecdotes that confirms that, there are far more, is the opinion writer from the New York Times, Maureen Dowd. You ever heard of her?
No.
Doesn't matter.
I
Just
haven't.
ask. Doesn't matter. Anyway, she's an op-ed writer with the NY Times, right? And she went to Colorado a couple of years ago to see what was going on with the legal cannabis there. And she went to a dispensary or whatever shop and got a cookie of some kind. And I think the story was that they warned her to be careful with it. I don't know what the dosage size of the whole cookie was, but she got back to her hotel room and she promptly forgot that and ate the whole thing. And and this is where it gets really interesting, because her description was, I thought I had died and no one was telling me.
Wow.
Yeah, in other words, total ego dissolution in that sense, right?
Yes.
Just the way you can experience that with LSD or ayahuasca or psilocybin in the larger dosage. Yeah. Uh,
Excellent.
Yeah, and this is essentially why I'm promoting cannabis as a spiritual medicine, because when you really know how to channel that energy, it does have that potential. It's not dissolving it into, some sort of meaningless chaos. It's dissolving the because ego doesn't exist right now. We're kind of getting into spiritual teachings, but the simplest version is that what Buddhists and other great traditions would refer to as ego is essentially just a collection of stories that we've put together and patched together as if something actually exists, right? It's like all the stuff we've learned is true or untrue and real or not real, or good or bad, or safe or unsafe, or that we can do or we can't do, or whatever. That's all this narrative package that we've put together over our whole lifetimes, but it only exists in thought. It only exists as this set of concepts and beliefs. And when this is why the psychedelics are so valuable, because when you do them in the right kind of context, they can dissolve all that and open you up to something that's real, that's beyond that. And cannabis can do that too.
I absolutely agree with that. And in fact, to be more revealed about me as an interviewer, some of those experiences where they were out in the world and I had taken too much of an edible, for example, it's put me on the really cautious, like step off side of usage ceremonially and spiritually with cannabis. And so like I'm probably closer to being comfortable with the dosage of 10 milligrams. And I personally don't actually smoke. And it's been recreational, legal in a lot of the places that I've lived here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the concepts that comes up in the Cannabis and Spirituality book from a number of the contributors is less is more, and it's twofold. One is if you're paying attention, it's like paying attention to the world around you. It's almost as if you walk through the world and you don't see anything around you. Then if you slow down and really pay attention, you might even think of that metaphorically as taking a substance that connects you in, where it doesn't have to be a substance, but just that kind of notion. With cannabis, you don't necessarily have to have a really large dosage to calm down and quiet your mind. That's the key, is quieting your thinking mind. It's not going to happen contiguously or continuously, because thoughts are going to come up, of course, but the magic, or which actually was more better described as unconditioned reality, you don't experience that. You don't even know it exists if you can't quiet your mind down, at least for a portion of the time, right? So it doesn't necessarily take a lot to do that, although from my point of view, good to go for it if you're in the right circumstances, and as I say, you can handle the stronger dose and still stay really present.
Right.
So that's excuse me. The less is more is about dosage, but it's also about frequency of use. That's the other half of it. Is that, again, there's a distinct tolerance effect if you're doing it too often. The endocannabinoid receptors need to kind of flush themselves out, and in my personal experience, this is not science, just my personal experience. For me personally, anything more than once every 3 days, and I notice some of the sharpness, some of the clarity, some of the expansiveness is not there with the same dosage. So I try to keep it down to, not more than every 4 or 5 days generally for the most part. Some of the contributors in the book suggest, more like once a week or even less frequent, You can measure, apparently, don't quote me on this, anyone, but I did read one time that you can measure cannabis residue or whatever it's called in the spinal fluid up to a month after taking it, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is actually kind of a strange irony as a little aside, because if you're working for a federal department in the United States and you're not allowed to use cannabis, they can easily check if you've had it in the last month or so. Whereas you could take heroin, cocaine, and a whole bunch of other intense pharmaceuticals that clear your system in 24 hours or whatever, and they wouldn't know, Bit of an irony there.
And it's also true with magic mushrooms? It'll clear your system in 24 hours, right?
Probably, yeah. LSD apparently is pretty much. I mean, it's such a tiny amount. They probably couldn't measure it in the first place. We're talking like 200 millionths of a gram, micrograms, is a full-on dose. I'm told that's flushed out within a couple of hours, which is actually quite sort of the magic of it in a way. Is like it comes in and it opens doors and says, "Okay, you're on your own now. Bye." Yeah.
So I'm going to take this train towards the end of our call towards a topic that we've touched on, and it's related to two things. First, the way cannabis is used with other psychedelics in tandem with magic mushrooms, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
The things we consider true hallucinogens, true psychedelics, in the old sense, and entheogens, as well as you talked about Denver, and Denver in the United States of America just recently decriminalized magic mushrooms, as well as Oakland in the state of California. So maybe could you speak towards psychedelic entheogen use alongside cannabis? I'm not disqualifying cannabis as an entheogen, because it is definitely there.
Yeah. Well, if you're just, not to get into that, but if you take the definition of both the word entheogen and psychedelic means mind or soul manifesting. Cannabis distinctly can do that in the right circumstances. Entheogen, generating the divine within, can do that. So, yes, I believe from that point of view, they qualify as psychedelics. So a little while ago, I described cannabis as an advanced spiritual medicine, because to really use it for waking up purposes, spiritually awakening, it takes some learning. It takes intention, a lot of attention, good environment, and so on and so on. Getting the dosage right, getting the strain right, all that kind of stuff. So on its own, it's an advanced spiritual medicine. If you combine it with other psychedelics, we're talking about even more advanced spiritual practices, because it can have a couple of different effects. And the one that most means it's, advanced work, so to speak, is that it can, the technical term is potentiate the effects of the other medicine, right? So for example, Terence McKenna wrote or said that what he liked to do when he took a large, what he called heroic or committed dose of the mushrooms, like 5 dried grams, like an hour and a half or 2 hours in, once that had settled in, whatever that, hour and a half point was, he would have a couple of puffs, and what he described, if I remember correctly, was he said it synergized, which means kind of like brought together and sharpened up and prolonged the visual element, the visions of the mushrooms. I had an experience one time when I took a sort of modest dose of mushrooms out in the woods, and or on a hiking trail. It was enough. I mean, it was enough to, really know it was there, but not too much to be walking around. This was many, many years ago. And then I had a couple of puffs, And what that did was it essentially doubled the effects of the mushroom, kept it as a mushroom experience, but all of a sudden it just opened things up. It brought on the visuals much more. I started seeing beings in the trees, you know, so I really started consorting with the ravens that were flying around there, you know, that sort of thing. Like, they seemed to recognize my presence, and we were having conversations. I'm speaking English and they're speaking Raven, but they're looking at me and going, "Rah," that sort of thing. So I'm being a little silly here, but that's the potentiating effect is really quite powerful. One of the contributors to the Cannabis and Spirituality book, who works with ayahuasca and cannabis, he's an ayahuasquero, essentially a shaman working with ayahuasca, and very, very knowledgeable about using cannabis as a sacramental medicine as well. He says in their ceremonies, they only do this with people they really trust and know well, who know themselves and know the medicine really well, that are very experienced with ayahuasca. So they'll sing songs. They have their rituals. You know, they have a kind of a religious way of going about this. They have a bunch of prayer songs and stuff, and they'll sing those for a while. They'll sit in silence for a while. Then they'll have a second round of the ayahuasca, and after that, with select group of trusted individuals, they may have a couple of puffs of cannabis. And the way he described it is, the ayahuasca takes you to the top of the mountain, and he calls it Santa Maria, but it's cannabis, gives you wings to fly in the wind. So it really can take things off. And again, if one accepts the notion that doing these substances in the right kind of circumstances with the right kind of guidance or container is really important to really finding out what they can do, and also to keeping it safe, so that you don't have a terrible experience and end up calling 911, then cannabis actually increases that potential. So even more care and skill need to be brought to bear. And then the other thing that cannabis can do, perhaps at the same time, or in conjunction with this potentiating effect, is it can actually smooth out the effects of some of these medicines a little. It not mitigate them, not bring them down, just kind of, warm them up or smooth them out or soothe them a little bit, so they're a little easier to handle while still having the same strength of effect, essentially. That's been reported a fair amount. And then the one final other use that has been reported from these groups that work with ayahuasca, for example, is that when they have a ceremony, they sometimes have a sharing session at the end. And if they share some cannabis at that point, like not during the ceremony, but at the end of the ceremony when they're sharing, what they find is that the cannabis helps them tune back into what they've experienced, remember it better, and articulate it better. Strangely enough, as opposed to people going, "Duh, what was I was just talking about?"
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually,
it's like the dosage kind of makes the memory and the experience brighten up. It's almost like too much makes us have time or memory gaps, and then the right amount in tandem with the biochemistry is perfect.
Yeah. So what I would want to say to anyone who's watching or listening to your podcast, Trevar, is if you this person whom I might be speaking to objects to what I'm saying, then you're welcome, of course. I don't feel any defensiveness about that. However, what I would like to suggest that you consider is that we are at a stage of human history where there needs to be a widespread consciousness awakening on this planet for us to survive in anything that does not look like a deep, dark, dystopian future. And we need to understand who we are and how we're connected to everything, planet, spirit, whatever. And start acting like that, not like children running around consuming anything we want, just because we're entitled to or whatever. That's not going to happen as easily as we go forward, I don't think. So the point is, the psychedelics, including cannabis, are very, very powerful, effective tools used in the right way. And so this is no time for dogma. This is no time for divisions and one person saying, well, you can't combine meditation and psilocybin mushrooms. We need to use all the tools that are available to us. And the psychedelics are the most direct and powerful tools we have right now. Somebody said, we don't have time for 20 years of psychotherapy right now, if that's the only thing you're doing, or even 20 years of just a silent sitting meditation for most people. Whereas if you can combine these substances, the sacramental substances, effectively with other practices, so not just cannabis with other psychedelics, but all of them with other practices, they can they're all the medicines are amplifiers, and if you use them carefully and skillfully, they can deepen these other practices. So folks, let's get rid of let's respectfully, humbly let go of any resistance to combining these substances if they're done properly.
Absolutely. I had a few comments in my mind about that, because in the past and on EntheoRadio podcasts like 8-9 years ago, we had dealt with several conversations that were traditionalist oriented, and they were discouraging the combinations. And I think you may be onto something, and I would respectfully forward your topic and your opinions and experiences, because I think that we are, as a culture on this planet, in jeopardy of becoming stewards of nothing.
Well put. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, it's too late for anything that's going. As I said, we need all the tools that are available to us, and there is no doubt whatsoever. Millions and millions of people over the course of history have used these substances for spiritual healing and awakening. That's experience. You can speak from experience. Typically, the people who are objecting to combining practices and medicines, they haven't found out what they can do in that combination. They're coming from a particular place, a particular tradition, yoga or whatever, meditation, spiritual practice, whatever it is. And they're saying, well, no, I've tried psychedelics, and I've done this, but I don't see them combining. But my guess is that it would be unusual if those people had really done it right, with the right kind of guidance, the right kind of protection, the right kind of ceremony, and found out for themselves what can happen. Because it's not a drug experience when it's done right. It's a reality experience. That's why they're so powerful, because the ego dissolution, as they say, you're not dissolving into some sort of Disneyland world or something. If you're using them properly, you're dissolving the illusion of the separate self into a real presence. And we need to do that. We need to look into that a lot more. But I would like to say, to sort of put it back on a positive note, that is happening. There is a vigorous psychedelic renaissance going on right now. You mentioned these initiatives for psilocybin. It's probably the next one after cannabis to come along, and get more and more legal recognition. And cannabis is already the kind of the advanced guard in this kind of legal recognition, especially as people find out about its spiritual power. It's kind of like a door opener, a gateway drug to, in the best way, right? And now psilocybin is the next one that people can kind of get a handle on in that way. And once psilocybin is legalized in a lot of different places for at least certain kinds of use, then that door opens even much wider. And then we can start talking more about the other ones as well. It's already happening too, And so ideally, what we could see in 20 to 30 years, especially as this whole concept of we need all the tools we can get, necessity as the mother of invention idea, that in 20 years or so, these substances are much more readily available for therapeutic use and spiritual use.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about where the conversation continues with you. And you mentioned something, Guru, and then your conference. Tell people where they can find you.
Sure, thank you.
Follow up. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mentioned Retreat Guru. That's nothing to do with me. Okay. That it's like the place I did the ceremony last weekend. It's a wellness retreat center, and they use Retreat Guru. It's essentially it's like an agent. But it's an online, it's a website. It's called Retreat Guru, retreat.guru.
Right.
I think it's great. I just learned about it last weekend because 4 of the people that came to my ceremony had heard about it through Retreat Guru. And so you can look, I don't have any coming up that are probably on Retreat Guru right now myself, but I would just say it's a good place to find out about retreats and so on. They have categories like yoga, plant medicines as an actual category right on the site, meditation and spirituality, health and wellness, and a few other things, right? And if somebody out there has a retreat center or wants to invite me to come and do a weekend of 3 or 4 days or whatever, they might be interested in Retreat Guru, because Retreat Guru takes 14%. The people register through them. They take their 14%, but they don't keep it if your ceremony doesn't happen. Like if you don't get enough people or something, you get all that. You get your money back. And there's no fees to join or anything. It seems like a really good service. Anyway, that's not really relevant to connecting with me. I have a Facebook group called Cannabis and Spirituality. I have a website that doesn't get anywhere near enough love from me. I don't do much on it, but once in a while I add another essay or something. And that's also cannabisandspirituality.com. And frankly, if people are really sincere and want to connect with me for anything related to this, I don't mind if they email me. And for that, they could email me at stephengraymedicine@gmail.com. So it's Stephen with a PH, STEPHEN, GRAY, medicine@gmail.com. Excuse me. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference is a wonderful event. We get about 600-700 people coming as participants, and leaders in the field: Wade Davis, Dennis McKenna, Paul Stamets, Jeremy Narby has spoken there. Lots of different people like that. Kathleen Harrison, et cetera, et cetera. And the bottom line, again, on that one is that it's about consciousness transformation for the planet. It's not ultimately about the psychedelics. It's about how the psychedelics are these potentially extremely effective tools for that kind of consciousness transformation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love that motto, that intention. I would love to make it to that conference. It's called the Plant Spirit Medicine.
Other way around. SpiritPlantMedicine.com.
.com. Great. And it's what are the dates for it?
November 1st to 3rd.
Okay. And this year?
This year. Big pardon?
2019.
Yeah. Next year it'll be probably happening again. That'll be our 10th anniversary next year. So it'll be around about the same time. But the specific dates for this year are November 1st to 3rd in Vancouver, British Columbia, way up here in Canada, when we do not live in igloos. And it actually is quite warm and pleasant in the summer. A little rainy on November 1st, actually. But, but bearable.
and I think I remember working a little bit with one of your social media heralds, a woman last year. I put out some information on some of my websites for the conference.
Oh, last year?
It may have been last year or the year before.
Yeah, well, I co-organized this conference with a fellow named Mark Caron, C-A-R-O-N, and he did this last year and the year before. You might be thinking of 2 years ago, and in that case, you're probably thinking of Selena Archambault, who was in Mark's role at that time.
Yeah.
And she did some really good reaching out herself at that time. Yeah.
We've been paying attention here in the States. Unfortunately, I'm in the Southwest, and I don't get up there that often.
It's not that far away.
I
make trips. Yeah. I thought you said you were in San Diego, or you don't live there? You're just visiting there?
Right. I'm generally either San Diego or Phoenix or Las Vegas. Right now I'm in San Diego. It's where I have my roots. It's where we started this movement.
Yeah. Well, it's only a 2 very long days drive to LA from here. I've done it down the boring I-5.
Yeah.
You just point your car south and sit back with your hands behind your head and go.
Right. Yeah. Especially if you have one of those auto driving cars nowadays. Yeah.
put it on cruise. I use cruise control on the I-5, cruise along about 75 miles an hour, Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I sense that there's more to be said, and I would love to create an extra call with you in the near future to keep this up and to answer unanswered questions, and also to maybe even follow up with people that make comments about some of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. No problem. Yeah. I could refer to, for example, more of the material that's in the book from some of the other contributors and some of the things that they talk about, the way to use it. We could go into a little bit more on strains, dosage, methods of intake, as they call it, a little bit more perhaps on ceremonial use. There's a couple of comments later in the book about cannabis's potential role in the future as the sacrament of peace. That's the most accessible of all the awakening plants in that sense.
I would love to start our next conversation with that topic right there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, you just let me know and we'll see what we can arrange together. Yeah.
So reaching out to our listeners for the last time, we're wrapping up our conversation here with Stephen Gray. And I just want to say thank you so much for everyone who's tuned in over the years to EntheoRadio, which you can still find our podcast of 125 episodes on EntheoRadio.com. You can find our fan pages on Facebook. You can find a Facebook group that I curate and administrate and share wonderful shamanic things on. It's Shamanic Herbs on Facebook. And you can find my external and additional projects like mushroomshaman.com. You can find those in social media, Mushroom Shaman. And you can also find me using various forms of Trevahr or Captain Hugh T. Alchemy on social media. And Stephen, signing out. I want to say goodbye. Any outros?
No, just really enjoyed rambling on like this, and thank you for being an excellent listener and well-spoken in your own comments and questions, and happy to continue again at another time.
Yeah, one more time, hold up the book for us so that it can keep being a bestseller.
This is my ratty copy that I pull up every time I want to look at something in it, Yeah.
No,
that's the other one. That's the original one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it says right on it, browse copy. Yeah. No, this is the Cannabis and Spirituality
book. That we were mostly talking about. Yes.
Yeah. 18 contributors to the book, counting me. Yeah.
All right. You're a brilliant speaker, and we hope to have you back soon. And we're signing out. So. Thank you very much.
And see if you can pull it off to come up to. Let me just say this: you can sign off if you want in the meantime, but. One of the reasons I'm involved with this conference is because of what I said a few moments ago about how it's actually more about creating an energy for a larger awakening. And the psychedelics just happen to be the one that we think are the tools that are the most important and powerful right now for people. So part of the conference is getting people of a similar mindset together. And there's an energy generated from that. And we've actually especially found that the last couple of years, that people like, when people like yourself with a lot of connection to these kind of medicines come in, bring their mind, in a sense, their energy with them, then by the Sunday of the last 2 years especially, it's the energy in that room has been palpable, because it's the kind of conference we treat it almost like a sort of a ceremony light, you might say. We don't spread them out into different rooms. We could do that, but we choose to have everybody in the same room for the weekend. And so it's actually kind of like on Friday night, we press the button on our spaceship and we take off for the weekend. And people have this, collective shared kind of journey that brings us back down on Sunday afternoon. And people have really been feeling that it's almost like we've created a temporary power spot or sacred site, for the weekend. And it spills out then after that. Beautiful.
Yeah. And say it in the correct order for me.com, because I can't remember the order.
Yeah, no worries. Start with the word spirit.
Spirit.
Yeah. So SPMC, Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. SPMC. Yeah.
And
Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. Yeah.
and
If you don't remember it, just listen to this podcast, because we've now said it about 6 times. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So spiritplantmedicine.com, or is it .com?
Conference. The Spirit Plant Medicine Conference.com. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, now I'm getting confused. No, the website is just spiritplantmedicine.com.
Right. There we go.
The conference is the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. Yeah.
Either way, if you put those words in some combination, you're going to get what you're talking about, I'm sure.
Especially if you are aware of Vancouver, because just for a fun little ending here, a group in Australia have like 90% ripped off our name. Yeah, they've added an S to the front of their conference that they're going to have like 2 weeks before ours this fall in Australia. Fortunately, it's around the world, so probably not too much competition, but they're calling it the Shamanic Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. They even borrowed my mission statement from our website and just reworded it. So if you're listening, folks, you need to be a little more original.
Well, it's a rising tide for entheogens, and it's going to float all of our boats, hopefully.
Nice attitude.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're signing off, and thanks for listening, folks.